Alright, welcome back. So we're still talking about that sort of middle stage of file processing. Again, the first stage is open, second stage is processing the data, and then the third stage is close. In the previous video, we talked about how you can write data to your file during that processing stage. In this video, we will cover the other end of things, how you can read stuff from your files. Again, this section is going to sort of assume that whenever you did an open, the mode that you gave it was R. Remember, the mode R is for reading, the mode W is for writing. So the most basic way you can read stuff from a file is if the file was open for reading, you can use a command called read to read the contents of the entire file. So you can do, the file object variable .read, and that will read everything in the file as a string and store it into your Python code. So something to sort of pay attention to with this: whenever you read data from files, it is always read as strings. Just like how whenever you read data from the user input on the keyboard, it's always strings. Even if the user typed in a number, it's always going to be strings. So just like with the keyboard input, if you get a number from the user, you have to explicitly convert it to a numerical type like a float or an int before you can actually do math calculations with it. It's going to be the same thing with files. Since they are read in as strings, you have to sort of keep track of that and convert them to numbers when necessary. Alright, so again, this is the most basic way to read data from a file. So this program right here, this is going to go ahead and read the contents of the file that we actually wrote ourselves earlier in the last video. So remember, in that last video, we wrote a new file called courses.txt, and that file looked like this. Remember, this was the file that we created. So now let's go ahead and write this code that basically does the opposite. So it's going to read the data from the file. So a couple things I want to point out here before I run the code. So this is the line of code that is creating the file object. We use the same open command. Here's the file name with the extension. Now in this case we're reading, so the mode is R. This is the name of the variable I'm using in this example. This next line of code, this is part of the processing part. So this is using this .read command that I just mentioned. You'll note that this is right after this variable, kind of similar to .write. Remember when you did the .write, you did it right after this same variable here. So what this is doing is it's reading the contents of this file as a string and then storing it into this variable. Then I'm going to go ahead and print the contents of this variable, and then the very last line of code, very important, do not forget it, is once I'm done processing all this information in the file, make sure you close it. And again, you use the same variable name here as you did up here with open. So let's go ahead and run this code here. Now again, this is assuming that this courses.txt file is saved on your computer, and it's saved in the same folder, same location as this Python code is. So if you're running yours and you're getting an error message, first check to make sure that you have this courses.txt file, then also check to make sure that they're saved in the same location. If everything works out, it should print the contents of the file, but right here in the Python output instead of in the file itself. So again, this is a pretty cool thing. You can basically bring in content from other files into your own Python code and do stuff with that. So at this point in time, I want to go ahead and challenge you to do the exact same thing with that other file you created in the last video, the one with your family members. So go ahead and write code that reads these names of your family members and prints them out on the Python screen. When you're done with that, come back to this video and we will continue on. Alright, so you saw in the previous example a way to read the contents of the entire file. The way you can do that is using .read. Now that again, that reads everything in the file at once into one big long string. That said, it might be a lot of information. A lot of the times when you are working with data from other files, you'll instead want to read everything one line at a time. Conveniently, there is a function that allows us to do that. So if you want to instead read a single line, you can use this function called readLine. So let's talk about what I mean by a single line. So again, readLine is going to read one line from a file. So a line in a file is a string of characters that ends with and includes the new line character. So every single one of these lines that you are going to read in, one at a time, they're going to be of type string, and they're all going to have a new line character at the very end, because that's what defines that it's the end of the line. Now there is an exception to this. The very last line of the file, there's no new line character, right? Because it's the last line in the file. So there's going to be no extra new line character at the end of it. Alright, so go ahead and edit your code from the previous example to look like this instead. And go ahead and run it and come back. Now, looking at this code, we're still doing open for reading. The only difference here is instead of using infile.read to read the entire file contents at once, we're doing infile.readLine a couple of times. Now, something to sort of note about readLine is once you read a line in the file, the next time you read more stuff, it will read starting at wherever you left off before. So in this example here, when I say infile.readLine and store that into line 1, that will store the contents of the first line in the file into this variable line 1. Now, the next time I say infile.readLine and then store it in line 2, that will store the contents of the second line of the file. And again, this is because these files are sequential access. So if you read a single line, you sort of have this, you can picture a tiny person sort of running around in the file. So when you open up a file for reading, there's a tiny person standing at the very beginning of the file. If you say read line, that tiny person runs to the end of the first line. So then if you say read again, it will start reading off from wherever that tiny person already is. So in this case, we're reading 3 lines, and then we close it, and then we print line 1, and we print line 2. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this so we can look at it together. Now I'm going to run it, run module. Awesome. So, as expected, the contents of line 1 and line 2 come out. Here's line 1, here's line 2. Now, you'll note that there's sort of extra spaces here. Let's talk about what's going on here. Where are these extra spaces coming from? So, these extra spaces are coming from the fact that when I read this new line here, when I read this new line for line 1, this is the line that it's reading, this CSC 110 line. But this CSC 110 line from the file itself has a new line character at the end of it. I know it has a new line character because there's another new line right here, right? We have CSC 110 and then we have a new line. So right here at the end, there's a sort of hidden new line character. So the string itself that's right here is actually the string CSC space 110 new line character. So that string is stored in line 1. And then when I print line 1, you'll remember that print itself also tacks on an extra new line character at the end by default. Remember when we first talked about print? Print will automatically print new lines at the end of this. So when this prints, line 1 itself is the string CSC 110 with a new line character from the file, but then we also print another new line character because of the print statement. And that is why we have this extra space here. We have a new line from the string itself that is read from the file, because every single line in this file has a new line character at the end of it, except for the last one. And then this extra one is coming from this print statement. So I know it's a little weird, but again, just sort of remember that every single line in here will have that new line character at the end automatically. So again, this is going back to, you have a little person running around in your file starting at the beginning. So every time you call read line, Python will move forward to the next line in the file. So if you read more stuff, it'll read the next stuff in the file. So just make sure whenever you're dealing with reading, just make sure you sort of keep track of where you are in the file. Now, that said, there is sort of a bit of a hacky way to force your file to go back to the beginning. Now, generally, you shouldn't have to do this, but it's still sort of good knowledge to know. If you want to return to the beginning of your file, you can use the following code. File variable, this is the same variable that you use when you open the file at the very beginning. Then you can use this function called seek. To go to the very beginning, you use the argument 0. Now, the argument that you put into seek, it's a little bit weird. It does not refer to the line, it doesn't refer to the character, it refers to the bits. So this is saying, hey, seek back to the 0th bit in the file. So it's kind of hard to predict where the second line or the first line and so on in the file is going to start with the seek, but 0 will always take you back to the beginning of the file. Alright, so more often than not, when you're doing this file stuff, you're going to have a file with a lot of lines, and the lines will be really similar, but they'll have different data on them. So more often than not, instead of saying, hey Python, read line, okay, read the next line, hey, read the next line, you're going to instead use a for loop to sort of go through each line at a time in a file. So the cool thing about reading files in Python is if you use a for loop, it will automatically go through each line in your file. So you don't even have to type read line. The for loop will read the line one at a time for you. This is the general form. For some variable, this is the loop variable, in file variable. Now file variable, again, this is the same variable that you used when you open the file. So for something in that original file variable. Now at this point in time, the loop variable has stored in it the first line of your file, and then the next time it loops, it will have the next line of your file, and so on. And again, the cool thing about this, as you can see here, I actually don't type read line in here. The for loop is automatically reading the lines for us. So this code right here, this will go ahead and run the code such that it will open the file for reading. It will go through each and every single line in the file, one at a time, print out the line, and then close the file. So go ahead, pause this video, take a minute, and edit your file so it instead looks like this. It instead uses a for loop to go through every single line in the file. Then when you're done with that part, run it, check to make sure that it's working. Once it's working, go ahead and do this sort of bottom challenge. Edit the code so that it also prints the line number with each line. So meaning, If it's the first line of the file, it prints the number 1. If it's the second line of the file, it prints the number 2, and so on. So go ahead and try this out. When you're ready to see the solution, come back to the video, unpause the video, come back, and we'll go from there. Alright, so hopefully at this point you have already done this sort of challenge piece on the bottom. And hopefully it looks a little bit like this. So I'm going to go ahead and run it, and then we'll come back and talk about it. So go to run module, and as you can see here, this is printing each line from this file, courses.txt, and also showing the line number at the very beginning. And we still do have these extra spaces. We'll talk about how to get rid of these in a little bit, but stay tuned for that. But let's go ahead and just sort of walk through this code and talk about what's happening. So to keep track of what line we are on in the file, I have to sort of have another variable that does that. So I have another variable that does that, started at 0, and then I go ahead and open the file for reading, save the file object into the variable in file, then I hit my for loop. Now again, when you use for loops to go through each line in the file one at a time, you do not have to type read line. This will already read the line for you. So generally, you probably want to use the variable line for your for loop because that just sort of makes sense. The for loop goes through each line one at a time. So for line in file, first thing I do is I add 1 to the line count. So this line of code, line count plus equals 1, that is the same as saying line count equals line count plus 1. It's sort of a shorthand for that. And then I say print the line count and the line. Now again, the line is a string which already has the content of each individual line in that code, in that original file. This will loop through each line one at a time and print them out along with the line number, and at the very end it will close the file. So again, please make sure you don't forget that close file right there. If you have any questions about this example, please do let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video.